think that actually it's 67% chance that you're holding the black bag. Why do they think that? Because they can divide 8 by 12, right? And that gives you 67. So they think that that's the probability of holding the black bag. A lot of people underreact to information because they don't know how to use it. Now, once again, think about a more complicated situation when you actually have to process economic data quickly. The data that you're uncertain about. Here, everything is certain, right? You know it's 8 black chips. It's different. And our theory models assume that people are rational. And people usually behave very irrationally. By the way, can you tell us how this 97% actually comes about from here? Yes?
I would guess that when you draw the first chip, you have like the equal likelihood that it's going to be red or black. But after that, each one you draw will turn the probability towards the one that you drew before.
Right, that's true. But there's a formula in probability, right, that you use to compute this. So who can tell us what that formula is? All right. Well, it's a conditional probability thing, right? What's the probability that this is bag 1? Conditional in fact, we just drew 8 black chips out of it, right? And that would be the probability of actually holding bag 1 times the probability of jointly holding black 1 and drawing 8 black chips out of it, divided by the probability of drawing black chips out of any of these 2 bags, right? So it's not something you can easily do in your head unless you do. But yeah, so that's how we would go about it. So something to take away from this is that our theoretical models, as mathematically sophisticated as they are, and they get really, really mathematically sophisticated at times, especially the latest ones, still have to make assumptions. The main one being that people can count quickly and efficiently, and people can't. So as soon as you figure that out, you start questioning what is it exactly that your model tells us, and how much truth there is to this. So that's the problem with theory. And physics theory is easier, right? Because black holes can count, or at least they sort of work by the physics laws. So we assume that they can count. People, not so much. So let's move to empirics. Empirics, once again, is a process that looks at historical numbers to figure out how they worked in the past, and maybe this will also apply to the future. But empirics can sometimes be tricky as well. Let's think about this little example here. I was recently reviewing a paper for a journal. And, let's first look at this picture and then I'll tell you about that paper. So, if I have a variable x that is equal to another variable x, and that is equal to another variable x, that is also equal to a variable, what is that last variable then going to be? X, right? So that's kind of a given. So recently, I was reviewing a paper for a journal that had this table in it, and you don't have to try to understand what these numbers actually mean. All I want us to do is to try to compare these numbers and see where the trick comes in. So the numbers are circled in red, right? So if you look at the, I didn't know that this was going to be so high, so I was actually hoping to touch this and show you exactly what I'm talking about. But let's try to look at the first column. The first column has this number and this figure and this figure in it. And this third thing here is the t-statistic that tests whether these two numbers are statistically different. And the t-statistic is too small, so these numbers are actually the same statistically. So although they kind of look different, but they're the same for us, statistically, right? Now let's look at these upper numbers in this one and that one. Their t-stat is this guy here. It's too low, so this means that these two numbers are the same as well, statistically. They're indistinguishable from each other. Same applies to these two. Their t-stat is too low, they're different. All of a sudden, actually turns out that when you look at these two, the bottom ones, their t-stat is significant and they're different. How do you interpret that? They can't be different, the other ones aren't. And it's all connected. But statistics tells us that they are, and actually it's very likely not to be the same. Statistics sometimes works interesting ways. But that's what we sometimes see. And this is a very simple example. When we get sort of down with really, really serious number crunching, sometimes we see really, really crazy things. So the problems with statistics are multiple, and with empirical research in general are multiple. One of them is, of course, the absence of data, or the lack of data. Sometimes we just don't have anything to analyze, right? So that's the bigger problem. Sometimes we actually have stuff to analyze, but it turns out later, after multiple papers have been written on this topic from this particular data set, that the data set was wrong. We actually had a very serious data set in analyst forecasts. You know, their security analysts would sit down in their offices and try to figure out what the stock is worth, right? And they tell you what their forecast is. We have a data set that collects those expectations from analysts, and then people try to analyze whether analysts are actually smart. By the way, do you think analysts are actually smart? Honestly, we haven't figured that out yet. Some studies show that they are, some studies show that they aren't, and this is exactly the problem I'm telling you about. There are no truths here. Depending on how you twist this data set or how you run your tests, you can find analysts are smart or analysts are not that smart. It's tough, right? So at one point in time, we actually figured out that data set was wrong. People who were compiling it weren't doing a very good job. So several years of research that had been already done by then, no one cares anymore, right? Because it's wrong. So empirics are tricky. Even if we have correct data, perfect data, there are still problems with empirics. Have you ever heard this word multicollinearity in your statistics class? Okay. So recently I went to a conference and I was discussing a paper that was trying to figure out if short selling is bad. I don't know if you guys have been following the news on short selling in particular, but there were a number of articles and opinion pieces in the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and the New York Times, where very famous people in the industry, such as, for example, Charles Schwab, or what's his first name? I don't remember, Mac, the guy from Morgan Stanley, and multiple others were telling the Journal and other newspapers that short sellers are bad. Sometimes they drive prices down because they sort of prey upon weak companies and stuff like that. This is a story that has been going on for years, right? So, well, if we have nice data on short selling and a nice historical sample, maybe we can test that and actually answer this question once and for all. Is short selling bad? We actually have data. But then we run into problems with empirics, problems with econometrics. One of them is multicollinearity. There are actually two types of short selling. And I'm oversimplifying this, but let's assume there are two types of short selling, bad and good. And they are very correlated. They happen, their volumes rise almost simultaneously and drop almost simultaneously. So they're very, very correlated. You have to put both of them in the same equation, because if you don't, your equation is misspecified, right? You can't model something, prices, as a function of bad short selling without looking at good short selling. That's bad econometrics. No one will listen to you. No. But when you put them both in your equation, because they're so correlated, we can't draw any conclusions. Our regression model will give us coefficients, but those coefficients will not be interpretable by themselves. We will only be able to interpret them as a group. So we can't do research on this, right? We can't answer this question. Is bad short selling really bad? So that's a problem. There are other problems such as causality, selection bias, survivorship bias, out-of-sample forecasting failures. There's so much stuff that can go wrong with your empirical study that every time you hear that, whoa, medical researchers tested a group of people and figured out that this particular drug works, you should realize that this is actually a function of statistics that they use. And had they used different statistics, maybe the result would have been different. And not maybe, but very likely, the result would have been different. Plus, you know the problems with medical tests, right? What's the biggest problem with medical tests? Yes?
You can't really experiment with them?
Well, you actually can experiment, right? You get two groups of people with the same disease. You give one of them the drug and the other one the placebo, and see if the one with the drug recovers better. So that's the medical experiments, exactly as they are, right? But what's the problem with that?